All right, we're live. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Arab Film Fest Collab for today's talk. I'm Ahmed Abdul Majid. I'm one of the organizers of the festival. We hope you've been enjoying our film lineup so far and the live programs that we're offering, and are also looking forward to what's coming up next in the coming days. Today, I'm delighted to present the talkback with the artists behind Moonship Dispatch and the Return of Osiris. This live Q&A is a companion event to the experimental shorts program Present Futures, Present Fasts. The artists will discuss the concepts that drive their work and their narratives, and the narratives their films construct and challenge. So let me go ahead and introduce them. Firstly, we're joined by Dani and Sarah from Barakunan, the art collective behind Moonship Dispatch. Dani Arbid is a writer and filmmaker based in Berlin. He is the director of Barakunan, a publishing and media collective, and is a co-founder of Electronic Literature Day. In 2019, he was awarded in the inaugural Bureau BDP Writing Prize for his novel, The Years of Things Lost, forthcoming from Broken Dimanche Press. Sorry. He comments on Lebanese affairs for journals Al Monitor and Nahar. And secondly, wordsmith, editor, and video and sound artist Sarah Huneidi. She graduated with a master's degree in comparative literature from University College Dublin and worked as a publishing assistant for independent publishers in London and New York. She currently lives in Beirut, Lebanon, where she freelances as a copywriter and editor and experiments with sound and moving image. She also co-founded media and publishing collective Barakunan, where she plays the role of managing editor and content creator. Also with us today is Essa Grayeb, the director of the Return of Osiris. Essa is a Palestinian visual artist working across different media such as photography, video installation, and text. Some of Grayeb's work are made from found objects, footage, and sounds, which he appropriates and manipulates. In his work, he touches upon notions of representation, absence, and loss. His work often originates from an examination of his personal narratives within the collective history and memory, while often weaving in and out of reality and fiction. His works have been exhibited in Palestine, Lebanon, and Italy, and his films have screened in numerous film festivals, including the Philadelphia Independent Film Festival, Toronto Arab Film Festival, and Haifa Independent Film Festival. Essa lives and works in Jerusalem, Palestine. And moderating with us today is Andrea Shaker. Andrea is an Arab American artist living on Dakota lands. She grew up in a small town in Connecticut on Kirby lands, savoring her Sittos stories along with her Sittos cooking. Shaker's creative work is interdisciplinary, spanning photography, moving image, experimental film, and written spoken word. As an Arab American, she explores the spaces between homeland, and migration. Through image and word, her work addresses how these spaces and movement of the body within the spaces are imagined and experienced through the physiology of intergenerational memory. Shaker has screened her work, her experimental films at the Twin Cities Arab Film Festivals, Walker Art Center, and Altered Aesthetics Film Festival. Her photographic work has been exhibited widely, including in Minnesota, Chicago, New York, and Glasgow. Her written work has been published in Mizna and Homeland, Women, Citizenship, and Photographies. She has presented her written and moving image work at the Radius of Arab Writers, Rawi conferences. She is also a recipient of the Minnesota Award and Minnesota State Arts, Minnesota TV Award, and Minnesota State Arts Board Artist Initiative Grant. Shaker earned her BA in Government International Relations from Georgetown University and her MFA in Photography from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She currently teaches art at the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University, Minnesota. All right, thank you all for joining us, and hopefully you will have a great discussion. I'll let you get to it. Enjoy.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm so grateful to be here today. I'm very grateful to the Arab Film Fest Collab for curating this segment, Present Futures, Present Pasts. Each film is powerful and speaks, I would say, concisely and evocatively to concepts of present, past, and future. there's also a strong conceptual connections with the three short experimental films in this segment. And I would say that there's a way in which these films almost converse with one another, you know, through some shared concepts. And in a way, I think the films in this segment are taken very powerfully individually, but as collectively, I think they also create a very powerful and construct a very powerful narrative. I'm also very grateful to the Arab Film Fest Collab for creating this opportunity for us to discuss the films. And of course, I'm very grateful to hear from the filmmakers of two of the films in this segment, Essa for the Return of Osiris, and Sarah and Dani for Moonship Dispatch. Before we get into some questions that I have, I also want to encourage folks watching this in the audience to post comments. There's a place in the comment section to post those, and I will be sure to try to get to as many of those as possible throughout our discussion. So the first question that I have for the three of you is a question around your processes. Your films each kind of draw off of and explore collaboration, collection, appropriation, and so on in terms of creating your films. And so I'm curious if you could speak to how your the processes in terms of making the films relates to conceptual underpinnings within the pieces. And whoever would like to start with that question.
Yeah, I can definitely jump in. So with our film at Barakunan, we don't have like a set structure or process. You know, we're all I think like many people today, just multidisciplinary, you know, producers. And I like what happened with this one specifically was we were invited to take part in reading. I think we might have lost Sarah because she's in Beirut and it's just tough. But if we have faith, she'll reappear.
I'm back.
Yeah, there she is. So like the process, I think has a lot to do with like it actually does intersect a bit with the content in a way because it has a lot to do with necessity, you know. And so we were invited to give a reading, and with Barakunan we often we enjoy like playing with media and using different audiovisual techniques to play with the audience's sensations and just to deliver a story in a different way. And so we had done these performances. Sarah and Jad is the composer, had done these performances in Jordan and I think in Abu Dhabi and in Beirut that were, I think, really captivating in a way. And we just wanted to continue with that. And it really comes together, I think, when you can put like in the audiovisual format, you can really put different layers together that don't have to intersect from the beginning. You just, you know, you can even just sort of find a way to like fuse them together in the editing process, which is why like you're using very modern tools to tell a very ancient story in a way. But now that Sarah's back, I think she should also say something about this.
Can you just, sorry, I missed the actual question. Can you just quick, I mean, I sort of, yeah, if you could just repeat the question.
Yes. So my question was how your processes, you know, questions of collaboration, collection, how those appropriation, how your processes inform the conceptual sort of framework or underpinnings of the work.
Well, we're a collective, so we're a bunch of individuals, and each of us also just does the role that they're best at. I mean, we often take different roles, but there's a particular skill that each person has. And I feel like a lot of our work is based on this fictional revolutionary movement. And sometimes it kind of, like the fiction and real life blur, and it actually feels like we're part of this revolutionary movement, even though we're just making art. So each of us has a role, I guess. So Jad is the sound, he's the composer. So we're all kind of in this world together, and we work together often, and we work with fiction. So sometimes these lines do just blur by accident. We even sometimes have sort of pen names. We put each other as characters in the work sometimes as well. Like this happens quite often. So there is an actual blurred line between the concepts and the way that we work. So Moonship Dispatch started because I was asked, like we were asked to do a reading, and I couldn't imagine, I'd never done a reading before, and I actually couldn't imagine just getting on a stage and reading from the book. So I thought it would be nice to have some sort of atmospheric, and then it turned into an installation the first time we did it. So it was kind of a humble but kind of magical installation that we did. And with Jad's machines, he plays modulars. So and with the subject matter, it kind of took on this very spacey, as if we're like, crew members of the same ship. And the writing often takes place in this, or it's set either in a ship, or often it's crew members. So the concept does kind of completely come from the process, actually. Yeah, so that's that. And we work with we made this film because initially it's just the digital version of the performances that we were doing. We usually have visuals in the performances, or some kind of installation or a setup, and they're usually quite surreal or spacey or magical. So we went for a digital look, or a digital process for this film.
Thank you. And Essa.
Yeah, I come from the world of maybe visual art, and I studied photography basically, and I found myself by accident in this world of the moving image, and I was very fascinated by it, and I always admired dealing with archival materials. So the visual component is always was in the center of my work. It was the center of my fascination, and in this case, I thought it's. I'm using basically the archival elements as a raw material that this is my paint that I use, and I just deconstruct and reconstruct these elements to maybe manipulate the storytelling, maybe to emphasize or have some question about who narrates things in life, who tells us the story. So these questions are very important for me. And this act of collecting and rearranging, and especially visual materials that had to do with some sort of a collective memory, which has also some traces of a personal memory that I bring myself into. I found it very powerful, and I think since you are there dealing with these materials, it's hard to go out and do some other stuff. So I'm in this practice, and my next practice also, and my next project is dealing also with the found footage, with archival materials, and especially in the if we're talking about archive, especially the Egyptian cinema archive.
Well, and that leads really really well into one of the next sort of thoughts or questions that I had, and has to do with all of your films, and the relationship with time, to time and to memory, to remembering, to retelling, and possibly even forgetting in a way. There seems to be a way in which I notice in different ways that time in each of your films is almost at once expanded and what's the word I'm looking for, but almost constrained at the same time, or or compressed. I think compressed was the word I was looking for, but there seems to be a way in which there's a relationship between how you each use time or explore the concept of time and that notion of retelling and reconstructing narratives.
I can just comment from Barakunan's side on that. Time actually was one of the notion of time in a sort of big, expansive way was the inspiration for this piece, because there's something that we actually always come back to, which is this idea, which is articulated, in like mystical poetry and more modernist poetry from the 20th century and stuff, of the cyclical nature of being, and the notion that as a species or humanity, we will arrive in the end of our times. We will arrive where we have begun, in a way. And when we were thinking about what story to tell for this piece, we wanted to create something original, and we often go back to this idea that sort of where we begin, which seems like when we think about time just as a species, when we look back at our history, we often do so in this really self-righteous sort of way, where it's like we're looking at we're better than the past, we've grown, we've evolved, we've moved on. And I think we're both, just Sarah and I, are quite interested in the nuances that appear when you look at classical literature, of even just a sort of expectation that maybe there's this there's a space in time that we can't actually look back to, that is pre-origin, pre our intellectual or spiritual origin, and that time might be the catalyst of our time in itself. So the story, the film, if you see it, it begins with that telling that this character, the narrator, has left from ancient Egypt, basically in the year 2495 BC, and they know at the time that they are a evolved civilization, and the way that we see maybe ancient Egypt today and most classical civilizations from antiquity is as sort of primitive technologies and stuff. But obviously that idea is broken from the very beginning, because she's talking about a spaceship and she's gone out into the universe, and I think the lesson that we're trying to work with through this character, for the character to work within themselves, is how to get humanity to realize this, that no time is exceptional, and that we don't actually have an understanding, like a clear-cut understanding of our origins or our futures, or where we're going, where we've been, beyond just what narratives we've created, to keep us going. And that there might even be a lot of wisdom lost along the way. And what she's trying to do as a narrator is she's trying to, and I won't give away like what happens, even though it's not like that kind of film, but like still, she's trying to inspire somehow this questioning, and this reflection of, and there's a lot of like conspiracy theorists as well who kind of deal with this on a very extreme way, which is also really interesting. Like people who look at drawings from antiquity that show like spaceships and like alien people and stuff like that, and these kind of ideas of advanced civilizations having visited us in our past. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting to reflect on that, I think.
She also, the character also has a bird's eye view kind of time, because she's in an ancient civilization initially, but then she ends up in the distant future, and she's a researcher on this ship. So she's actually looking back at history. She's researching, you know, humanity or civilizations, and she starts to sort of realize that things are just kind of happening again and again and again. The same things are happening again and again, and this thought drives her crazy a little bit, or she decides she wants to do something about this, I guess. Yeah.
And she has like, Sarah, you know more about the angel of history as an archetype, but like, so she reflects on the notion of the angel of history as well, right? I mean,
yeah, so it's Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, where he sees this bald clay painting, and it's this angel looking back at the past, and it's basically a critique of progress as a measure of like human worth or of civilization, and this kind of brute forward movement of progress. I guess in some sense it's technological progress, or just this idea of accumulation, of course, capitalism, you know, more, and that somehow means that we're, you know, doing better as a modern civilization, but obviously that isn't necessarily true. So she reads about the angel of history. She comes across the Walter Benjamin manuscript. Yes.
My film is archival film, so the element of time is very important in that sense. My film is a video montage, which combines scenes that I took and quoted from different films and series from the Egyptian cinema. I stopped in particular time in June, the 9th of June, 1967, when the late Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser gave his epic, tragic speech when he declared the loss of in the war of 1967. And an event that still resonates till now. Like I was thinking about it right now. Yesterday we remembered the 33 anniversary of the Palestinian Intifada, the uprising, and today there is clashes in the occupied Syrian Golan with the Israeli forces. So what's happened in 1967 is still happening right now, and we are still living the consequences of what happened back then. But still, like in my work, I'm digging, and when you dig and excavate, you find things from the past. So you deal with the past, and for me, it's a very interesting for me to maybe to research how we deal with our past, especially in terms of post-traumatic nation or a nation that is still living in some sort of instability. So we still reflect in the past, and we're still relying on this past. And maybe I don't know. There is this notion about us being Palestinian. We are still like there's this nostalgia that we try to like avoid, and maybe we are still stuck. There is this article that still fascinates me of Jalal Tawfiq that talks about the withdrawal of the tradition in a society which live post-trauma. So I think that and I always like ask myself why I'm not dealing with something that's happening now or maybe in the future. That's why I love the film and the title that you give to this program, which is the present and the past and the future. For me, the past is still the present, And maybe by the way that I'm dealing with this archival footage and manipulate them, maybe I am like I don't know, rearranging them in some sort of act that I bring them to the present and make them like I put them, I shade a new light on them, so they will be. They are appropriated, they are mine now, and they are presented as something that's happening right now, you know?
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, I think in both of your films and with, you know, the Return of Osiris, there's just so much that sense of time and the movement between sort of the present, the past, and the future. And one of the aspects that I think about when I was looking at both and watching both your work is how you know, and you, Essa, kind of talked about sort of this notion of, you know, post trauma nation, right? And Dani and Sara, you talked about sort of the notion of Western exceptionalism and how that is playing out in your work. And one of the ideas and thoughts that I had was around how your works relate to colonialism, you know, both historical, present, and potentially even, you know, kind of like in the notion of the future. And so I'm very interested in hearing if you might be able to talk about that relationship between you know, rewriting, reimagining narratives around, you know, more dominant narratives or narratives of colonialism and experiences of colonialism. You know, in terms of how it affects, you know, what you were just saying, Essa, in terms of, you know, how we live in the present. Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to mention colonialism in this specific occasion with the film that brings Nasser. Nasser, who fought it, and he preached for Pan-Arabism, and there is this pink dream that I know people in '67, the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria, they were like hurrying up that they Palestine will be free and they will be back to Ramle and Jaffa, and everything was shattered. So this dream of Pan-Arabism nowadays, while I'm crafting this film, a lot of people were looking at me. They gave me this look. Why you are like dealing with Abdel Nasser and right now, and why you are dealing with 67, and there is where this people were this encourages from the Arab Spring, and we are still like trying to see where we are going, and suddenly we remember that of maybe a dream, a bigger dream that maybe my parents and my family had back in the 60s and maybe before. So I think it's interesting to look at this thing, that's how the past is reincarnates right now, and dealing with 67 right now, maybe by looking at the main it's maybe popular culture back then in the 60s, 70s. My film is combined some different elements and some different footage from the 60s, 70s, and in that sense, it's very diverse. So it's I had black and white footage next to a color footage, and it's interesting to see this work in popular culture and to learn about maybe people's hope back then, and to see the characters. And in my work, I just cut it a whole piece of materials before the speech, where people were celebrating victory. They were hearing in the mass media that there is a victory that's coming, and then it was a slap, a big disappointment. So maybe to learn about the hopes of the people and the hope of the nation. And for me, I think it's. I'm not a Nasser fan, and unfortunately, I'm not. That I don't have much knowledge of in cinema, in particular, in Egyptian cinema in particular. But for me, it's a movie and it's a film about a leader who approaches nation in a very, very difficult time, and it's very emotional. And there is a human being that's unpiles there in that speech. So every time I see it, this thing, it's very emotional to see this communication between a shattered leader that we always, and the icon that we lived and raised on this icon and a great leader, let's say.
Yeah.
On the notion of, because you mentioned Western exceptionalism, which is something that we mention in the synopsis of the piece. And I think it's interesting because the reason why we talk about Western exceptionalism is we're talking about modern Western exceptionalism, which is our modern world, and for however long the West has been the predominant social, cultural, and political and economic force, at least in our part of the world as well, which is part of the history and the story of colonization in our part of the world. But what we're also interested in is the idea of even beyond, collective trauma is one thing, but collective ecstasy or collective ignorance is another thing as well. That also has a massive impact on the way that we organize society and we progress. And Western exceptionalism is what we are dealing with today, in that I think we are positing is preventing a truly uniform and universal vision towards the future, because there's a collective of people whose history defines not just their own but also others, and whose impact, even like one thing that we can talk about is, for example, climate change. The story actually was heavily influenced. The first drafts of this piece were obviously much longer, pages that we couldn't fit into like a 10-minute film, and a lot of it dealt with more specific issues, because right now it doesn't really go into like the meat of like what people are dealing with today. But originally the point was also to speak to the audience of today, in a way where, like, okay, this narrator has a vision from antiquity, and they're speaking to you from the future, so they have this giant web of time that they can see through, but they're speaking to you today. And what is your world like? What's your world defined by? And I think coming to terms with what our world today is defined by is this sort of this distance and this gap. And I think this gap of intellectual necessity and sort of spiritual necessity, and the issue of climate change, I think, is at the heart of this, because if you ask most people that are like living in the West right now, for example, who are not of a migration background to the West, let's say, what is like the biggest issue that humanity and planet Earth is going to face in the next 100 years or the next 20 years, they predominantly will say climate change, whereas if you ask anyone coming from a migration background who lives in the West as well, so you would think that their experiences might be more similar and they can be compared, probably the number one issue in mind isn't climate change, right? It's something else. It's like trafficking, like human trafficking, or war and arms sales, and just dictatorships and human rights and things that are just so immediate that you don't think about, you know, the ozone layer when the atmosphere is deteriorating. And I think that distance is a reflection of colonization to a degree. And so it's more like, because if we were really to get into the meat of how does this film reflect a story of decolonization, I think that's a different question, because that has to do a lot with the character themselves, and how do you apply this character a voice that isn't influenced by Western understandings of what a hero is or what a character is, you know. And these things are things that we deal with as artists and as writers anyways. You know, we think about like, what is the motivation for a character who hasn't been defined by Hollywood? You know, what is the motivation for a female character that hasn't been defined by Victorian and Hollywood standards or something? But for us, it was much more Western exceptionalism is a story, is true of our time. And I think you always have this, you always have a body, a political body in the world that is the dominant body, and rather than dealing with the issues that should be dealt with, that body ignores those issues and leaves them for future generations. And that's something that the story is trying to speak to, is that idea.
Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I was saying, I think we're also at a moment in time where, so we're in like post-colonial, so we're kind of realizing that the struggle or whatever it is now transnational, and maybe that's something, how it goes back to Issa's film, that go to a moment in time where they also saw that there was a sort of geopolitical reshuffling, and it was a kind of now or never moment. Of course, it was very disappointing in the end, but there was a kind of borderless dream in a way. And now I feel like there's a similar borderless dream, but it's expanded thanks to, I guess, you know, again, capitalism, I guess, but if it goes back to it, but thanks to capitalism, basically, we're far flung, we're all over the world at this point, and share a similar, we need sort of, the thing that connects us needs to be larger than just a pan-Arabist dream, and also this sort of, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna stop there.
That's great. Yeah. Well, and you know, all these kind of you know, kind of play into sort of one of the other thoughts or questions that I had, and that that maybe are sort of intertwined. Maybe it's sort of a few questions or comments in one, but you know, there's very much a way in which the role of the spectator or audience in your films is, you know, you know, we move between being watched, being a spectator, watching somebody else, in some instances. And so this notion of participant, subject, viewer, and that whole relationship as seen between, you know, behind the sense of, you know, the screen, right, and screens and multiple screens, as well as, and I think it really touches on something where I think the films address both an intimacy and a distance at the same time. You know, there's a way in which there's an intimacy in terms of what's going on, and as well as a distance. And I think, Dani, you alluded to the sense of distance earlier. But I would be really interested in hearing you, you know, speak about, you know, how you think, how you see sort of both maybe intimacy and distance, or the role of the spectator, audience, participant, subject.
Well, our film is in second person, so we're directly addressing the audience. And we often do that with our work. I guess it goes in line with it being driven by this fictional political movement. So you're often addressing the population. It also gives it a sense of urgency, I guess, and it implicates the audience in the sort of most direct, easiest way possible, which is just literally speaking to them using the word you. And I think that it's kind of difficult to do that and not either sound, you know, pedantic or a little bit annoying. So it's difficult to do that. But if a character does that and it's not you necessarily, it's not me. It's the, you know, it's the researcher of a ship in the distant future. So I think it's a powerful tool, but it's also very at this second person. But it's also you have to be careful with it, kind of. Dani, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I agree. I think that you do have a responsibility when you're speaking, because you're projecting this directly towards the people that are receiving individually, and I think that is the point, and that was the point. So in a way, it's a form of cosmic propaganda or something, and it has this intention, you know, and it so I guess you do know what you're doing when you're doing that, and you're using tools that can really manipulate people's sensations, like, you know, strong auditory experiences and sonic experiences, which the composer that we work with is just amazing at doing, and building a soundscape to just dive into and dissolve into. But the reason why I think that we do that as well is because it's really hard to speak to, and it's hard to find an audience anyways, and to build an audience in the first place. But once you do build an audience, it's also difficult to make sure that the audience isn't a crowd, you know, and it's actually like an audience, but of individuals, you know. And I think when you can build that kind of relationship, it's not just one way. It's you know, it's definitely two-way, and I think it just really, it brings out maybe the integrity of what we're talking about in the first place, which is diluting narratives that have stifled us or have separated us, you know, and alluding to something else.
In my film, I think there are two spectators. The first one is the audience who see the films, and they see films about people watching another speech or film or broadcast or radio. And I think the powerful notion is about you finding yourself in the same status as the characters. You know, like you're living these moments as if you are one of the characters who are like gathering around the TV or radio, and they are like witnessing this speech and this broadcast. And you are like, maybe you hear the speech, and the speech is very dramatic. So the drama of the film is built. It's reconstructing the drama of the speech, because it has a structure which is very, very dramatic, and then you find yourself also has responses to what you hear and feel, and then you see all the characters collapse and maybe go to the street. This is what happened in reality, or what we know what happened back then. So I think it's also if you are talking about intimacy, so we are seeing people in their living room viewing mass media broadcasts, which is I think it's something very on the spectrum of private and public. So it's a public speech, but there is a personal reaction to it. Like I think this is the feeling that I thought that I will have as a spectator watching this kind of materials. I remember myself watching Christian Marclay, The Clock, this iconic work, and being there, living the same moment that the characters living, and waking up at 4 a.m. for a phone call from somebody. I think there is this uncanny feeling that it holds, that you are mixing these roles of who's watching whom, And in my film, I had this intuition to erase the character, erase the leader. So you won't see his face, you won't see his you will only hear him talking. So it was very very important for me just to bring the voice and the characters and the everything that was built around the speech, around the responses, or hearing or watching this epic moment. So yeah, I think I always enjoy being like maybe frustrated or confused of who's watching me. Am I there's a person that is preaching or talking to me, or I'm looking at somebody. So who's looking at whom? And this power dynamic, I think it's a very it's had a very powerful component in it, and I think it's in experimental video art. It's about playing with these notions all the time.
So, you know, kind of going off that in terms of both of your, you know, responses and discussion of that idea of the role of the spectator and participant. You know, one of the questions that I had was in terms of and I think with Moonship Dispatch that you've talked about this a bit, but as a fictional revolution or fictional revolutionaries. I'm wondering if you all could speak to the idea of whether you think or how you think your film fits within sort of the notion of resistance or revolution or intervention in some ways. And maybe related to that question is you know, how might experimental films specifically be able to play that role, or what might be their roles in reconstructing narratives?
Well, from a personal perspective, because we often work within the same structures that we produce Moonship Dispatch in. It's all part of, as you said, fictional revolutionaries work to a degree, which is like, what is that? What is like a fictional revolutionary? You know, because if you're saying that to yourself because you're saying you're fictional because maybe you're not on the streets, or you don't have like you know, I don't know, an AK-47 or something. But essentially, I mean, if you're dealing with if you're trying to deal with an act of resistance of some sort, which is if you're producing something, you're either resisting against something or supporting something to some degree, you know. And I think that for us, revolution is a word that we deal with all the time, and anyways, as is resistance, just as a personal process as well, because we're trying to understand where like, why have we decided to devote our lives to doing these things, and these things being creating really like purposefully creating a diluted sort of structure that's like a sort of civilization sequence, civilization engineering of something that's completely outrageously fictional, but at the same time reflects so, you know, absolutely reflects the world that you're from. Like you have the full freedom to create fantasy, but because you are so tied to your world, you don't actually create fantasy, right? So you just create, like we've created this universe, the story universe, but it doesn't have it. There's like very little that's different from our world, so it could just be our world. But we've chosen to change the names and change some things because of maybe a process of wanting to like reflect more our modernity, which is the experience of modernity is, especially for certain certain people who have, I guess I would also say, like, have a privilege of mobility. The world has shrunk to a degree, and what we've learned, I think, along the way is that, like, there's the local resistance, you know, there's a local revolution, and then there's a transnational revolution, and within them there's so many middle grounds and different offshoots, and all of these, they don't always play into the same they don't play into the same, I would say, political program, you know, and of ideas of necessity and you know what you demand to be done and to be changed. And I think from the film, we were really curious about how we could reflect on the things that's why, like, at one point in the film, there's certain cities are pointed out, and the narrator talks about the fate of those cities in this time, because we're very aware of the fact that every person on earth has their own personal experience. And it goes back to what we were saying about decolonization, because, like, for me personally, I think that there was obviously in my life, there was a academic and spiritual and creative artistic process of decolonization, but there was just as an important a process of personal decolonization, which is like, how do you reconstruct yourself, reconstruct the way you see the world, reconstruct your perception from a timeless sense, you know? And I think that's what we're trying to, like, project with this film, is this sort of timelessness that it's very difficult when you do get on the ground and you are on the streets and you are dealing with actual resistance and intervention and this stuff. It's actually, you know, this film doesn't actually play into those narratives, because the narrator is a bit exhausted with the human political process and a bit, like, exhausted with everyone's local issue, you know, because, like, they're trying to bring attention to the fact that, you know, we are just in this cycle and this continuous cycle, and our local needs, while they outweigh obviously the international needs for you as an individual, while you live in your lived experience, in the totality of our history and our future as we think about it, it's just grossly inefficient to try to, like, save yourself to that degree. Yeah.
And if I might add, so I guess also in a way, this film, but it also it comes from a larger body of work, and it's a voice of, like, many different characters. It's a voice amongst many different characters and many different voices. It's part of a series, but it's also, like, a part of a Moonship Dispatch series, but it's also part of a larger literary universe. And I think the fact that we made up, or we created a fictional revolution, is we basically created an all-encompassing, perennial, multi-dimensional, transnational, cosmic revolution, because I guess in a way we believe that that's what it would actually take. It's a revolution that we can't, that seems so far away. I mean, we've seen many of our, you know, revolutions or uprisings or whatever fail. So we kind of create this huge, almost like impossible revolution that's completely all encompassing, that, like, that's, you know, you're revolting on every single level. You know, you're revolting with time and space as much as you are with your body, and as much as you are politically, and as much as you are. So it just, yeah. So we created this imaginary, impossible revolution to sort of not even dream toward, because we know it's you know, it's impossible, but just to sort of confirm this notion that we have, that actually it's not about just going down to this. Not that's not important, but it's not about just going down to the street and demanding your rights, or demanding a different regime, or because that's just going to, whatever regime is going to come into place is going to you know, go rotten. So it's a total revolution that we've sort of imagined.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting is that you're also the actors in that fictional revolution, which I think becomes really interesting in that regard. You know, so in some ways, maybe you are going, maybe metaphorically, down to the streets, or through, yeah. So.
Yeah.
I think Dani mentioned the narrative, and I think just thinking about it right now, I think maybe kind of resisting the main narrative or things that we've been taught. It's very. I think this is kind of a resistance that we also can offer, like questioning things that we been raised or thoughts. Or I think it's amazing that Larissa Sansour's film In Vitro is also in the program, and she questions about like she's being a person who lives the dream of others, or feeling the nostalgia of others. So and it's a very, very strong notion. And I think this is the role of I think also the cinema. Maybe it has some sort of narrative, and you can question it. Like in my film, I put a film of maybe Karnak, let's say, which is a film of a Sadat regime who comes to like draw a very wrong picture about the Nasser regime. And there is another next to it. There is a film that sees Nasser as a leader and as a hero. So putting them together, and how cinema can be manipulated and how it could be used as a propaganda, you know. So I think, and then taking these charged materials and putting them together and creating another narrative and agenda. So I think it's very powerful, this tool. Yeah.
Definitely any kind of art. I mean, there's a front, there's a narrative front to the fight, whatever it is, and it's a very important front. And I guess whenever a work confronts this or actively tries to subvert or create a different narrative or whatever, I think it's important to the general, perennial, constant, consistent revolution.
Exactly.
Yeah. And as we I'm noticing we're getting towards the end of the hour, I thought maybe I would ask each of you in terms of you know, how you see this the film that you've shown in this segment to kind of fit within the larger framework of your work, your body of work as a artist, filmmaker, and maybe a little bit of you know, where to from here. And I think Essa, you had kind of alluded to something that you're working on and spoke about that a little bit. But just, you know, a little bit more about where you know, how you see it kind of coming back to like within the larger framework, and then you know, if you're have something that you can talk about that you're working on right now.
Mm-hmm. The Return of Osiris is actually it's a part of a bigger installation, bigger body of work that I've been working on in the past, let's say, 5 years now, which again takes archival materials and trying to reconstruct things from the past. But as I said, the story began with a private maybe memory that I had from my childhood. I grew up in the Galilee, New Nazareth, and I remember a portrait of Jamal Abdel Nasser being fixed on the wall of my grandmother's house, and I grew up to this. I grew up thinking that this person is my uncle. So I was looking in different houses for my uncle's picture. I was asking people, "Who's this person?" They were like, "This is Jamal." So I remember myself like being surrounded with these walls with the Jamal Abdel Nasser portraits, and then when I grew up, I didn't relate what's how come an Egyptian figure, leader in the houses of Palestinians in the state of Israel? So and then I discovered that he's also an uncle for a lot of people. So in the other, while working on this film montage, I found the specific portrait of Jamal Abdel Nasser that I had in my grandmother's house, which it was burned in the 2001, I think, and the portrait is gone, together with another, with the whole scene of portraits of Jamal Abdel Nasser in the houses that I used to visit in my childhood. And then when I saw the portrait, I printed it and I wanted to frame it, but it was tilted because the camera was there. So I thought of maybe correcting it or editing it. And then I thought maybe I should frame it as it is. And it began as a project that I'm like looking for portraits of Jamal Abdel Nasser in the scenery, in the settings of Egyptian films, and I cut them and reframe them so they are tilted and they are pixelated and you can see it from far, and when you come near, then you can see it's pixelated and it's not clear. For me, it's this immortal series of portraits that they will be always be hanging on these walls, because every time you'll see Asfour of Yusuf Shaheen, and this moment, the portrait of Jamal Abdel Nasser will appear on the wall. And I think it's a work about memory, because from far away it's clear, and then when you are trying to remember maybe, and you're coming closer, then this image is suddenly it's blurred and it's pixelated, and so I thought about having my maybe a story and personal memory with a bigger story and a bigger frame and memory of a lot of people, and I'm talking about this figure that it's being shattered in the portrait. So for me, when the audience comes to the space, they see the images and they hear the sound from a next wall, behind the wall. And then when they go, they see the films and they see that the sound that they were being that they hear, it comes from different sources. So there is much of a manipulation. I am still working actually on this body of work, and it needs a lot of time. But I'm also working about another project which combines two films screened back in '91 in Egypt, and surprisingly, both films were based on the same script, which was the Italian script from '46. And actually, I have that VHS. It's one of them is Ra'i wal Nisa, which is the last film that Saad Hosni appeared in for Ali Badr Khan, and the other one is Raghba Mutawahisha for Nadia Jundi. So both films were like surprisingly screened at the same time in theaters in Egypt, and they were both based on the same script. So I'm trying in my work maybe to offer another version or to manipulate them. Yeah, so it's still in process.
Let's see, Sada.
Yeah. So the film, as Sarah said earlier, is part of a series which we call Moonship Dispatch, and the idea with Moonship Dispatch was to it just kind of came together as, you know, you can think of it like a moonship, so this like cosmic vessel, and a dispatch from this moonship, which gives us, I think it gives us the ability to speak throughout time and throughout history and in the future to people in a way like a dispatch would, you know, and like what I'm thinking about usually when we're writing these pieces, and when we think about like how to keep the stories going, and how they sort of fit in with each other, is how we can play with the as we were saying earlier, the fictional and the realistic in a way, and the realist. And Moonship Dispatch fits into that in the sense that it obviously we're speaking to you today. We're speaking to whoever you are, sitting here today. But this is coming from a voice that's much wiser than us, because it sees all of the lens of human time. And the reason why that's interesting to us, and I think how I can lead into the rest of our work with this is because what we're constantly trying to do is build a methodology, not just of our own production, but our own communication with our audience. Because at Barakunan, I think at least the way that I see it is that it's one thing for us to produce the work ourselves, but the reason why Sarah earlier said fictional revolutionaries, and that keeps coming up, and you have terms like dispatch and these is because we do see it as logging onto something that's sort of ahistorical and has this intention to communicate directly and in this form of cosmic propaganda or whatever. And that has two faces to it. So there's the practical, and the practical being, even if you think of the production process of this film and a lot of our other work, it's very communal, it's very collective, and there's a lot of do-it-yourself elements. Like, okay, if you can design and make a record and do this and do that, then you do those things, and that's a kind of self-reliance that is necessary in times of urgency, and times of collectivization. So there's the practical relevance just by itself. Then there's the formal relevance, which is more aesthetic, and the aesthetics of the project and the ideas, which is trying to also animate literature in a way where we can bring the literature off the page. And I think recently we did this festival called Electronic Literature Day, and it brought a lot of people together. And what we wanted to do with that was kind of do with others what we do with ourselves, and I think that was a really rich process, because we were able to really work within the same realm of possibility, which we usually have when we're dealing with audiovisual production and these things, and as well, without having these ideas of what does it mean to have high production quality, what does it mean to have what are these expectations of what something should sound like or look like or be like when you produce something, or how much of it should be planned, or should you as an artist wait 9 months to hear back from that one grant to see if you can produce that film, or can you just do it as easily and simply as you can, and is it your right to do so, and is it your obligation to do so? And yeah, before Sarah also gives her input on this, and just to say what we're going to be up to, we're actually planning on taking Moonship Dispatch a little bit more, producing a little bit more regularly, and we're kind of on the back of what was a really nice experience with the Literature Day. Just being able to work with others and collaborate with others was really it was really inspiring for us. So I think you'll see a lot more of that, and we do have a few audiobooks coming out in 2021, and we are printing the next book in one of our serial publications. Yeah, but I'll let Sarah continue.
No, I think you gave a pretty good roundup of what's happening with us. I'm excited about these, what will hopefully be weekly dispatches from the moon.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there will be, I will be communicating from the Moonship with that lovely space modulator sounds. So yeah, I mean, that's something to look forward to. We can do it pretty, I mean, it's a fun process. Dani usually writes, and then he'll send it over to me, and then I'll edit, and then I'll go over to Jad, because Jad's also here in Beirut, so I'll go to Jad, and we'll read over it together and decide on an atmosphere. So it's a fun process, and if we can do it weekly, I think that would be very exciting for both us and our audience. We are excited in general about digital programming. Yeah.
Wonderful. Before we wrap up, is there anything that any of you would like to just add that you feel oh, I wish I had you know, said that or would like to share that. No? Okay. Well, again, this was such a pleasure to have you here with us in terms of this conversation, so rich, and hope that sometime in the not too distant future, we'll be able to welcome you here in person. Whether that to be to Minneapolis or somewhere else in terms of speaking in person. But this was just wonderful, and I want to really thank you for your time, your generosity, and the amazing work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Welcome.
And
thank you for having us.
To the Film Fest team also. It's a really amazing program. Thank you.
It really is.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Right.